I'm going to tell you an origin story for a bunch of origin stories that may or may not be accurate. The original, absolute original story for this had to have happened after the first story I'm going to tell you. Laser or ion beam induced high temperature and pressure in a sealed vessel with deuterium and tritium mixed becomes plasma. This creates an intense pressure and heat and a plasma state, stripping these gaseous atoms of their electrons, which flow away to the outside surface of an intense rotating magnetic field, forming a donut-shaped mass of glowing plasma with a line in the middle of this donut, in the center of it, containing the remnants of the cores of the deuterium and tritium, containing protons and neutrons almost exclusively, the rotating magnetic field slowly pushing this matter towards the middle and towards itself, squeezing it to create a fusion reaction that's controllable and is able to be turned on and off at will and produces enough energy to maintain the magnetic field so you can shut off the equipment and it will sit there and feed very efficiently off of just the minor amount of fusion reactions that will always happen if you put in a couple of grams of deuterium and tritium into it. And acts as its own swept system to pull in the matter you drop in, to where it not only annihilates the atomic bonds and causes fusion, it annihilates the protons and the neutrons so that you can get what can only be described as neutron power, proton power, a quark fusion system, or more accurately, a atomic fusion system that produces a quark fission power plant. This is not the stuff of sci-fi. This is something that you can demonstrate on an incredibly tiny scale, under ridiculously high pressures, under ridiculously high temperatures, for very, very short periods of time. You can annihilate an atom to the point that the electrons, protons, and neutrons break down to whatever the base level is, quarks, and then they reform spontaneously into other material. But for that short period of time, you've achieved ridiculous amounts of energy. This is energy that's stored up by simply matter forming at the beginning of the universe and sometimes in the core of stars that explode. That's a lot of energy. Very tantalizing. And then the practical problems come up. This is 60s, 70s, and 80s. The 1970s energy crunch really drove a lot of research, and the 1980s it waned. Now, we're not talking about whatever it is you want to talk about. We're talking about what was in the stories. Now I'm going to read the bullshit story that was designed to test people's critical thinking skills and whether or not they were willing to follow a cult of personality or obey authority figures when they sounded authoritarian. An irradiated mixture at 250,000 atmospheres and 150,000 degrees Celsius, or 150 K degrees Celsius. K means kilo, metric, which was ignored by a lot of people outright on the internet. Spun at 50,000 RPM, but someone added an S onto it, so it's RPMS. And this was irradiated, and this mixture of mercury, not some light element that would do anything, but something heavy, mercury, gas, that was under real pressure, so it turned from a gas to a plasma and then was compressed enough that it became almost a liquid again at amazing pressure and amazingly high temperature, not low. Supposedly was the power system for the Nazi bell-shaped hovercraft or any other story you wanted to, and would nullify gravity because it would also nullify inertia, because it would reduce the mass by, and this is the correct quote, almost, the word almost, space, 90% symbol. Now, if you're not aware of why I just used percent symbol, and I'm also indicating that the degrees symbol was stuck in the story, and that Celsius was hated by a lot of Americans, and that 150,000 would be abbreviated accurately to 150 K for scientific notation and for simple space saving in the days when a byte was expensive. And people typing in RPMS, which may or may not have been a joke or an error. Obviously, this is a retelling of the story about the fusion reactor. And I want to point out something important. Almost 90% reduction in mass. If you annihilate the cores of tritium and deuterium to where the protons and neutrons begin to break down, they will reform, but they release more energy in what we would call a quark fission reaction. And they lose almost exactly 90% of their mass each time the reaction happens. And then it reforms. So yeah, the entire story, including the rotation rate, 50,000 RPM, worked out to being, if you're not aware of it, almost the same frequency that we used in one of the tests. So someone looked at a bunch of scientific papers or news stories or blurbs in the New York Times about people trying to create a fusion reaction chamber and accidentally ending up with a quark fission machine because it would destroy some of the protons and neutrons, which is the reason that it doesn't work. It does this extra step, uses up some energy, and it never breaks even, so you don't get enough energy out of it to make it worth doing. It's an interesting science experiment, but it also speaks to the possibility of blowing up New York City by accident with a power plant the size of your fist. People stopped funding this stuff. Now, at the same time, in the 80s, when this revelation became kind of a doom and gloom thing, they were experimenting with delta wing aircraft. The original version of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, which is really what the black triangle mythology of people seeing it, not a myth, real thing, is based on, is simply that, if you're not aware of it, when you look at the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, it's a delta wing. It looks like a black manta underwater crater, same aerodynamics, but the back of it has these jaggies in it that makes it look like the bat plane, the bat jet. Those notches were cut into it to get rid of the radar signature on the back. That's actually something they did afterwards. Originally, it was literally a purely delta wing flying wing aircraft, literally shaped like the TR-3B. It was the TR-3B people were seeing. That's it. The Air Force hasn't come out and said that because that would mean they'd have to admit they were flying this thing a little smaller than it was able to hold a human. They didn't actually put test pilots in all of them. They made them fly by remote in a radio frequency-free environment, and they were designed to glide and maintain altitude if they lost signal, which means they'd have to admit that some of their drones that were based on stealth technology eventually, but at the time just a big black triangle that didn't have a pinger on it, might have gotten away and gone over a populated area. No, they're not going to admit that because fuck that. Oh, one of them crashed out in the middle of nowhere. Well, they were built in such a way they annihilated themselves totally on impact and anybody nearby. Anyway, about X number of years later, some people say almost exactly 7 years later for some reason in the comment we're going to be discussing in a minute, they confessed to knowing about these spaceships but they made it a stealth bomber. Yes, it totally had to be space technology, not a flying wing design used by the Nazis in the 40s, being scaled down to be something that's flyable as the B-2, Spirit stealth bomber. The original flying wings were enormous. You can see some of them even in movies. They were crazy big, and some of them were powered by jets. And yes, some of them were arranged like a manta to have a central engine array, sometimes several of them, like the Valkyrie, like the Concorde. Every delta wing aircraft runs into the same problem. If you use a delta wing, you don't want to interrupt that wing. But you can strap an engine under it and put a scoop, a bow shock scoop. It's a virtual intake made by the shock wave from the wing front. So anyway, that's where the story came from. Yeah. The term Aurora in 1985 was really the budgetary code name for a bunch of exotic aircraft projects, one of which came out as the B-2 stealth bomber. There's a bunch of others. You can look at Air and Space Museum. They're sitting there. They say they're part of it. They look about the same. There's about a dozen of them, but they didn't fly correctly, or they didn't get money, or some senator didn't get a hard-on looking at them, so they didn't go through. The Aviation Week article in 1990, March, one of the four, because they're weekly, that happened showed that it was a $455 million boondoggle that actually paid off. And again, originally, it was a purely delta-wing aircraft. It didn't have the notches in the back, and it matched exactly what the TR-3B looked like. That's it. That's the entire story. Edgar Rothschild Fauch, in 1998, put out a book that mentioned this, was called this, or said it during a speech. It depends on who you talk to. And Ben Rich, Lockheed Skunk Works Division's former head, wrote a book at one point that said the information about it being part of Project Aurora, and that's it. And it wasn't called the TR-3B, although the TR-3B, or some name like it, was used as a code word for one of the projects. It was a flying wing design that was made as clunky as possible as a test bed, presumed to be crashable. It was an expendable item to see what they could push it to. Sometimes you got to test things to destruction on purpose. And again, some of these, not all of them, actually the majority weren't, but some of them were drones. They just flew, and if they lost signal, they'd just keep going. It being designed to be a stealth aircraft didn't help it being able to pick up a radio signal sometimes. And may or may not have run into people's houses and got them to keep quiet. But they were definitely seen because, yeah, people saw them. And then later on found out what they were, and some accepted this answer. The original TR-3B story may have been copyrighted or invented for the purpose of mixing up a fusion story with almost every characteristic in it, by the way, substituting mercury for hydrogen, and making up the story and then saying, what do you think of this? And if people didn't critically analyze it, they would be quietly ignored or literally put on the ignore list by everybody on a BBS, because you could do that, or just told, hey, here's a new BBS, it's got cool stuff, and they just throw them over there so people could have some real discussions about things. You're running a web board that's talking about airplanes in your area and get people showing up talking about little green men. All of your opinions are equally... No, they're not. They were kicked off the board. A lot of them got banned outright or told to go away or IP banned. Except AOL. America Online gave everybody the same IP address, default. You couldn't be tracked by your IP address because AOL was, and this is scary, as long as you used the command prompt DOS functions like FTP and Veronica and Archie and all the other shit that was available, was the most secure network on the fucking planet as long as you didn't pay for it. The disk you got, it used to be a floppy disk, had all the software on it that you could run from a DOS prompt to get it to do one thing. Have unlimited time to access to go on the internet, dial up only, but you could also do it over network, to download AOL software. And if you just told it to pause the download, you had a command line access and even a Windows 3.1 interface to go on the internet and use AOL for free without them being able to stop you. Because it was part of the free trial that never ended because it was based on it starting when you finished downloading something. If you kept not letting it do it, you had unlimited access. But I'm totally not guilty of that. But it gave you an IP address range that was untraceable as fuck. The TR-3B story is claimed to be originally created by Teresa Douglas and Steve Douglas, who wrote and published a newsletter called The Intercept and ran a BBS, which may have had the same name, and operated AOL and other website, aviation, and military forums that were called something you've never heard of. It was called Above Top Secret. And it was used as a basis, the story, whether they want to admit it or not, when it became popular, to weed out people who don't do research or who claim to do it, and they get mad when you ask them, so, did you know that mercury freezes solid at 234 degrees Kelvin? And claiming something's liquid mercury at 150 Kelvin, which is colder, is dumb because it's not able to be a liquid, and it can't be a plasma. However, at 150,000 Kelvin, it's obviously already heated at high pressure, and it is a plasma. So someone's response to me pointing out just that one detail, ignore it immediately, and then say, you have a lot of faith in Wikipedia. And then said, I can't provide any proof of anything because nobody could ever post anything because it would be tracked by your IP address, even though by definition where it showed up, AOL, your IP address was hidden because AOL was one single IP address. Scary story. Mystery meteor strikes a carpool. Gas explosion happens at a house that had no gas pipes. We know about meteors hitting the Earth. What is the government covering up about these impacts that you don't hear about in the news except as being a cover story about a gas pipe blowing up or a car being hit in a carpool lane when nobody was there? Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. That'll be a video later this month.